Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and like so many people, I'm a Carolinian. And that does of course bring to mind the song by Sting. I'm a Carolinian, a legal Carolinian. I'm an Englishman who's been to York. Well, I think it went something like that. And I have been to York. It was a while ago and I saw a magnificent play there. It was Charlie's Aunt, the 1892 comedy. And if you think that name sounds familiar, it's because it was later turned into a musical in 1948 with music by Frank Loesser and the new title of Where's Charlie? But that is a digression. Although given the name of our new king, perhaps not that much of one. Well, welcome back to Musical Talk for another conversation about some of the shows that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Now, of course, usually the coverage of the Fringe falls to me because it's one of my great pleasures every year to spend a lot of time in that wonderful city, Edinburgh, seeing so many shows, so many musical shows. And of course, musical shows are the bread and butter of Musical Talk, and so it's only right that I come back and discuss some of them with you. Because the Fringe shows of today sometimes become the blockbuster hits of tomorrow, and you only need to think of 6 to have that proven. But it's also nice occasionally to hear other people talking about the Fringe. And so last week's episode of Musical Talk, where Nick Hudson spoke to 2 of his friends who had been to the Fringe for the very first time this year, was very refreshing, I thought. And I think that conversation illustrated the thing that I've been saying for so many years, which is the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is intoxicating and wonderful. And if you ever get the chance to go, you should. Nick's guests last week had never been to the Fringe before, but you heard their excitement. To misquote another lyric, this time by Madonna and from the musical Moulin Rouge, they were EdFringe virgins, touched for the very first time. And as you heard them say themselves, they'd love to go back. So it is with that spirit of excitement that I'm delighted to be able to tell you that today's conversation is with our old friend Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted American composer, who fell in love with the Edinburgh Festival Fringe by his own admission by listening to episodes of Musical Talk, and then put his money where his mouth was by coming over to the world's largest arts festival in Edinburgh one year, and found that he loved it so much that he comes whenever he can. Well, not only was he here this year, and what a delight it was to see him there at this, if you like, revival edition of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2022, but he and I saw lots and lots of musicals, some together, some apart. And over a number of weeks you're going to hear our conversations, because we had plenty of conversations, where we spoke about some of those shows and discussed them in depth. And in today's episode we're going to touch upon 7 such shows. Although I do hope you have a particular taste for the year 1606, which I'm sure you'll know immediately is the year that Macbeth was first thought to have been performed. Because Shakespeare has done very well out of the 2022 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, as you'll hear in this episode, where amongst other things we discuss 3 different versions and takes of Macbeth in musical form. So, for the record, you'll be hearing about Macbeth the musical, Vote Macbeth, Don't Say Macbeth, Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes, Living with Sin, Stephen Sondheim's Company, and we'll touch also briefly on a one-man show called For Queen and Country. And that's quite a full bill of fare. And I hope that you'll enjoy the conversation that Mike and I had discussing these 7 shows. So, let's not keep you away from that treat by me waffling on. So I shall cut the waffle, at last I hear you say, I've got very good hearing, and invite you to enjoy the next hour in the company of me and Mike and our reminiscences and investigation and discussion about the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and some of its musical theatre highlights. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. it's wonderful to see you again. Well, you and I are both in that sort of glorious post-Fringe phase of both fatigue and delight, because we've both been up there. We've both been up there for a chunk of time, and we've both seen a lot of shows. So how are you feeling?
I'm feeling simultaneously tired and a little bit nostalgic already. When you're in the midst of an experience, you don't always appreciate how that's going to be a memorable touchstone of your life. You're just focusing on time to get to this show, and when does this one start, and all the logistical stuff.
Where can I eat?
When can I eat? Exactly.
And why am I eating this?
Often. But afterwards, you look back on the same events, which at the time seemed very pedestrian and logistical, and you say, oh, that was a really nice experience. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Edinburgh is fabulous because its parts are usually very entertaining and always different. And yet, of course, the sum of its parts are even greater. It really is the literal thing that is greater than the sum of its many, many parts. And it has enormous numbers of parts. The thing I should ask, though, this year, in some ways, the 2022 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, if it was a B picture, it would be described as the return of the Fringe. Because obviously in 2020 and in real terms 2021, there was no real Fringe. There was no Fringe at all in 2020, and it was mostly virtual in 21 and just a tiny number of shows. It wasn't organised in the same way at all, and most of the venues weren't operating. It was a handful of things. And a friend of mine went up, a friend of this programme, Josh Clark, and he reported back on it for us, and he essentially ran out of musicals to see in a couple of days. So our experience was very different. But I'd like to know, what was your response? How did this year's festival Fringe feel to you?
If I had to put it in 4 words, it would be Fringe is back, baby, because it really looked similar.
Can I just say I'm very glad I didn't ask you for it in 4 words?
that might have gone the wrong way. It really felt like a return to normal-ishness. The shroud of COVID, of course, still clouds the experience, and I'm sure there are people becoming sick. But the bulk of the experience felt very close to what I remember from the last time I was there during the carefree days of Free 2020.
Yes, 2019 now looks like 1,000 years ago somehow. The things I noticed more than anything else was, and I think it was quite tangible, funny enough, was that it felt like a slightly smaller Edinburgh Festival Fringe when compared to, say, 2019 as the apogee of the previous regime, or run, perhaps, in the sense that there were lots of people there. You certainly wouldn't say it was not well attended, but you could tell that there weren't quite as many people, I thought. Certainly when I walked up and down the Royal Mile, it seemed to me that you could get from one end to the other end pretty much unmolested, by which I mean, usually you have to sort of jostle and force your way through. It's sharp elbows and shoulders forward. And it wasn't like that at all this time. And also there was fewer performances. There were street performers, but what you might call the people who have got shows in venues weren't also doing extracts from their shows on little mini stages. There were no little mini stages. Did you get a sense of that?
I did actually see one of the mini stages. It was just it was in a park in Newtown, I think. And I think there might have been a few of those, but as you can see just from the description, they were a little further afield than they had been in the past, where you'd get these demonstrations right in the mile. My metric of Fringe crowdedness is how long it takes me to get from Southbridge to Northbridge or vice versa. And there was quite a bit of the shoving and being shoved and dodging and why is that person stopping to look at their phone when there's 50 people behind them? All that.
Well, and this family of 12 are walking abreast.
Exactly. And I guess part of the bridge was shut down for construction, so maybe it wasn't a fair comparison. But to me, the density felt similar to past years.
Did it? I thought it went off very thoroughly after the weekends. The weekends were very similar, but which is, of course, when the local population also go to many shows. But I really thought it sort of thinned off in the week. I also thought there was a slight change in the centre of gravity, and funnily enough, you've alluded to this. I think that the Royal Mile had stopped being the centre around which the whole thing revolved. Because I thought that the Bristow Square, the George Square area, where the Gilded Balloon Teviot is, had become a new central gravitational point. And it sounds to me that you're also suggesting that the Newtown, which is on the other side of the railway line, which, if you like, is the bisector of Edinburgh in the city centre, also had elements. And I know the BBC had moved up to that side. So, it seemed to me that perhaps the Fringe was starting to spin out centrifugally, if you like, from the Royal Mile. So the Royal Mile was relatively less and the other parts were more relatively crowded, but that's just a sense of it. And certainly I got a sense also there were slightly fewer shows overall. I thought that the number of musicals, there were plenty, but not quite as many as there had sometimes been in the past. Did you get a sense of that at all?
To a small degree, but For our listeners, I want to frame this in a way that makes sense, because you've been going to Fringe for 10 years or thereabouts? 15.
Or was it? It might be 450.
Right. You've been there 20 years before Fringe was founded. You're an old pro. I've been going for 5 years, so I have a certain sense of what the festival's like. But to someone who's never been, the differences between 2019 and this year that we're more sensitive to, I think would be imperceptible. And I always want to encourage people who are listening and are sort of Fringe curious to go to Edinburgh if it's in the realm of possibility, or to some of the other Fringe festivals if it's not, because it is the world's largest performing arts festival, at least in the English language sphere. It's enormous, it's dazzling, it's packed. So the differences you and I are seeing between the halcyon 2019 and this year are relatively small, and we're only able to notice it because we've been there. So if you're a listener, we're still trying to sound the siren song of, come check it out. And you shouldn't feel like this is a half-hearted remnant of glory days. It really is very similar.
Well, maybe I should clarify, and thank you, that's a very good point, because yes, I would like to say that I really enjoyed myself this year. When I say that I thought it was smaller, it was only smaller in a relative sense to its enormousness of the past. And actually, 2012, the Olympic year, was also a smaller Fringe and turned out to be one of my favourite Fringes, possibly because of that slight smallness. But as I say, that smallness is so completely comparative to the fact that it is the largest arts festival in the world, exactly as you've stated. And it is still the best week I've had this year. It's the best week I've had in 2.5 years. Probably the best week I had since I left the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2019. So, yes, please don't get the impression that in any way I'm suggesting that it was a lacklustre Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year. It did not lack lustre.
Plenty of luster to go around.
Yes.
And I should also add on a personal note that I started my tradition of going to the Edinburgh Fringe started because I listened to you talking about shows, and I thought, that sounds great. I want to check it out. So, there's such a personal element of musical talk as a podcast being a gateway drug to getting on a plane, in my case, and going to the festival. And I want to preserve that for other listeners who might also feel like they're on the brink of going and they just need a little bit of a push off the cliff.
Oh, off the cliff is a bit of a strong term. Certainly.
I took that from Spinal Tap.
my argument would be, yes, exactly. If you would like to try the Fringe, it is back. That is the message of this year. The Fringe is back, and it is back as it was. You're quite right. The points we're making are minimal and tiny. But actually, I don't think changing the focus from the Royal Mile to some of the areas outside is at all a bad thing. I went to some venues I'd never been to this year and really liked them. I went to a fantastically friendly one, the Drill Hall. It was called Army at Drill Hall, and I think it was in East Causeway Street or something of that nature. It was slightly outside of my usual area to go. I don't know if it's been a venue before, but I'd certainly never had any reason to go there. And I went to a magnificent show, and every single member of the armed forces who were based there, because it's an active military base. I think I was there too. You saw a show there too?
I think it sounds familiar, and was that sort of a little bit north and maybe a little east of the festival?
That's exactly where it was.
Yeah, that's where I saw Dots and Dashes.
Oh, and I saw For Queen and Country, which was a fantastic one-person show with songs, although songs from the Second World War, so of the period, so I suppose you would call it a jukebox one-person show, telling the life of a man called Dennis Rake. He was an out gay man in the 1930s who was taken on by the Special Operations Executive branch of the armed forces in the war, was stationed over behind enemy lines in Europe as a wireless operator to help the resistance, and even got as far as dragging up to perform for the German military officers in Paris. So it was quite the life, I think, would be described, in sense of, that's not a career that one would expect in the armed forces. So his was a remarkable life and a well-documented one. But the personnel at the Drill Hall could not have been more friendly, both as we were coming in, taking tickets, but also their events manager came out and introduced a show. I mean, there was a question and answer session afterwards, and a long-lost relative of the central character turned up. It was a lovely show in many, many ways, but it was so nice to go to another venue, and there was a lot of that. I went to places I simply hadn't been before. I went to the central hall relatively near to the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, which I also went to for the first time. So I was going to all these beautiful, Scotland's got so many lovely venues, so many lovely places, but it was just nice to expand one's horizons. So that's what I take home from this year's Festival Fringe. Anyway, I think what we've done there is set the scene quite nicely. And I do hope, exactly as you've said there, Mike, that people understand that what we're saying is the fact that it's fabulous. Come and see the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2023 or thereafter, because it's always worthwhile. I've not yet had someone go who I know who didn't enjoy it. It's always fabulous. So, a couple I know came up for the very first time this time, and they both told me what a joy it was, and they were only there for a couple of days. But it was a joy for us because we were there for rather more than a couple of days. And of course, over the course of that, we saw a large number of musicals, as it is to be expected. Some of those we saw together, some of those we both saw, but on separate occasions, and some of which, as always, I saw and you didn't, and vice versa, you saw some which I didn't.
Indeed.
So today, we're going to have a bit of a chat about just some of those shows and our responses to them. And I think we should start today, well, actually, I'm going to talk thematically, and it's entirely appropriate that this person should be so very well represented at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe, but MacBeth, of whom you may have heard, had at least 3 musicals with his name in the title. I say, this Mr. Shakespeare, I think, might be going places, because his shows seem to be really, really very popular with musicals.
I counted at least 6 shows with MacBeth. I don't know if they were all musicals, but I did a search for MacBeth, and 5 came up, and then I added Vote Macbeth, which just for whatever reason didn't show up in the search menu. So there's at least 6. I think Macbeth is the Robert Burns of the 2022 Fringe Festival, because in past years there have just been so many Robert Burns productions, and I think this year he's taken that title.
Well, good for Macbeth. It's about time he succeeded in something, frankly.
Indeed.
But I can guarantee that 3 were musicals, or 3 were adaptations which were musicalised. Well, let's talk about each of them, but briefly. I'm going to talk first about the one you didn't get to see, which was called Macbeth Musical, which tells you everything you need to know, but it was essentially a jukebox musical. They were telling the story in a highly comedic form, and it was genuinely very funny, and the cast was all women and one man, and they were all multitasking and playing all the roles, and some excellent puppetry. Fleance, who's Banquo's son, was performed by a sort of a foot-high puppet, which worked really magnificently, actually, when he has to jump on a horse and ride away to avoid being assassinated. It was some good stagecraft. It wasn't just... it was a send-up, and it was terribly funny, but it was done with some real skill. The thing I liked about it was the fact that what they had done is taken a whole set of contemporary bits of music, popular hits, and re-lyriced them to tell the story of Macbeth. Sometimes the lyrics were significantly changed, and sometimes they weren't. So I won't dwell on it really, because actually, in the sense of it being it wasn't a new written musical. It was a musical which was a collage, I think would be the nicest way of putting it. But I will just briefly point out, I was very, very delighted by it when Banquo's ghost turned up, that he sang a song, I get bumped off, but I get up again.
I think that gives a good idea of the flavour of the whole piece.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any more to say about that show, except that it was highly, highly enjoyable, but slightly more, and I don't mean this with disrespect to Macbeth the musical, but slightly more crafted musicals, i.e. specially written scores. We had 2. There was one called Don't Say Macbeth, and there was one called Vote Macbeth. And they were both very good. They were both very different. And I think we should start with our view on Vote Macbeth, because I'm going to start by briefly saying it was one of the highlights of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year for me.
I really agree. There were many things that were remarkable about the show. One is that it was sung through. So there was a real sense of momentum, kind of ferocious momentum, bringing you from the beginning to the end. And
in an hour.
In an hour. I mean, I'm trying to think I think it psychologically felt longer, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way, but there was such a sense of, I think what it was is that you're caught up in the tumult of the show, and you never stop to look at your watch or think, how long have I been here? It puts you into this timeless state. And I think part of that is the relentless energy of the music and the efficacy in which it's stuck to the story. All these moments of these beats in Macbeth, well, I guess I should frame it first by saying the premise of the show is it transports Macbeth into a tale of contemporary Scottish political succession. So the president is appointing, I guess you don't appoint a vice president, but he has a choice, right, between Macbeth and Banquo. And, they're vying for his favor in whatever political role would be the equivalent of what happens in the Shakespeare original. One of the distinctions of the show is that the 3 witches are turned into 3 newscasters. This is an incredibly smart move. Really artistically, it's a great choice because they are commenting on the action throughout, not only in their newscasts, but I think just atmospherically. They are the 3 backup singers who are always there. And the writing for them, which is very much in kind of a meta pop vein, was so skillful. It was so well done that it elevated the score. And I think their presence is what gave the score this sense of flow and continuity, and this feeling of you're never exiting this heightened world of musical storytelling. Does that match your own experience?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you used the word intense. I would use muscular, because it was it's still a brutal piece, as Macbeth, the original master document, as it were, is. It remained true to all its beats whilst being a clever adaptation. But it was the driving force of the music. I think you hit the nail on the head there, absolutely. The driving force of the music, sung through, song after song, with so much, they didn't even allow themselves the enjoyment of allowing the audience to clap each song, which we clearly wanted to do, but it was very clear that we're going to go straight into the next song to push the plot even forward. And it felt like a roller coaster of politics. It was a political thriller, quite a brutal political thriller, but the pacing is what made this so successful. Exactly as you say, they crammed a lot into an hour. There is a longer version of the show. I had the privilege of talking to John Paul Liddell, who was the writer of the whole thing, after Shakespeare, and indeed history, let's be honest. But it was interesting that it came as a longer version. So this is the adapted version. It's been reduced to an hour. The fuller version is going to be produced. It might be coming back to next year's Fringe, which will be wonderful to see, whether it's going to be in its short version or its long version. But it's certainly a show I would revisit next year. But to touch on the witches, there are some... the thing is, it's a political thriller. It's brutal. It's active. People die. People scheme. You could see this as a Hollywood film or as a 12-part series on an American television channel. But it also had light-hearted moments. And also some of the conceits were so cleverly done. I'm going to go back to the Weird Sisters. They represent that. The first thing we see as we walk into the room is a news desk. It's a desk. It's a white desk on the table. And on the front it just says 3W News, which of course is hilariously interesting. I mean, 3 witches or 3 weird sisters. And of course, one of their early songs is "You Heard It Here First" is one of the lyrics from it, which of course allows you to do that kind of speculative news that is so common in the current news world, which actually acts as a premonition or a prediction. So you still have the witches acting as, in this case, newscasters, but predicting to Macbeth what the future holds through speculative news. So you're right, that conceit just works perfectly. And the score itself, well, once again, muscular and driving, I think, to be honest. It just boom, boom, boom. Every song, it was in a pop idiom, really, wasn't it? I mean... Right.
Very well produced. I don't remember a lot of the stylistic details, but there were, I think, elements of electronica, a lot of contemporary pop. It felt very contemporary, maybe not quite as much ripped from the charts as Six, but kind of in that realm. And the production, we were listening to pre-recorded tracks, if I remember, but it was spotless.
Backing tracks, yes.
Yeah, the tracks were spotless. They were professional grade. And the vocal writing was so skillful that it just it clicked. It reminded me a little bit of Little Shop in that you do have the trio of atmospheric background singers who are commenting on the action. And as in Little Shop, there, as you said, there's a rationalization for why they're there. They're not just random chorus that's commenting. They're newscasters, and as such, it's natural for them to comment and to prompt people to hold the microphone in front of them and to get, it was a fake mic, which was funny because I think there were real mics buried in their hair. But to hold a mic up to somebody is a natural, it's a natural way to prompt them to give exposition. So it was perfect for a musical.
What I remember at the time very clearly was the skillfulness of the lyrics. I thought the lyrics were witty and clever and crafted, and to be honest, were almost... I mean, I liked everything about it, but I was most impressed by the lyrics. I thought, here's a lyricist who knows what they're doing, knows how to... And this is sometimes when a song is populated with pop genre musical theatre music, it can fall into the trap of pop. Whereas actually these pushed the narrative forward. It had to, because there was no dialogue. But also the character of the individuals was really amplified through the songs, i.e. they didn't all get one voice. You could still tell that this was Macbeth or this was Duncan, or, the characters lived in the songs, not just through performance, but because the songs were crafted in a way that allowed their characters to be seen and delineated. And that's quite rare, I think. Well, it's rare enough for me to comment on it, particularly in a pop-flavoured score. As I say, it was pop-flavoured, but I would not have said the lyrics were particularly pop lyrics. I don't mean sloppy rhymes or anything like that, or even weak sentiments, the "I love you" and "let me tell you for 3 minutes why." It was much more dynamic. Dynamic is the word, actually.
I think that there are two elements here that are being packed together, and one is the technical aspect of the lyrics, where I think, as you implied, they were predominantly perfect rhyme. But there are also the cleverness and the quality of having logical but unexpected turns of phrase, which, the latter of which we hear in Hamilton, but not always the former. It did not dip into the sort of more hip-hop pop tradition of slant rhymes and things that sort of rhyme. There might have been a few, but I think by and large it felt like the technical aspects of the lyrics were great. And the reason for liking technically polished lyrics is not just so you can, be snotty and give it a good grade. It's because they're easier to understand.
Yes, cohesion and understanding is a really important part of any play, you'd have thought. And is sung through musical. It is possible to lose your way, but I don't think this did at all. I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions about one or two of the narrative choices. Not because I'm questioning them in any reason other than they were interesting. It seemed to be set in a kind of what I would call a Soviet Democratic Republic version of Scotland. And as we know, Soviet Democratic Republics were so democratic they had the word democratic in their title, right, but almost nowhere within their infrastructure of government. I.e., the more you tell the world that you're a democratic republic, the less you are likely to be a democratic republic, I think. Certainly a democratic. And the flavours there, I thought, was that when they're emerging from a civil war, the Thane of Cawdor has had an uprising and has been defeated basically by Macbeth and Banquo. Duncan is safe on the throne, apparently. Well, it's not a throne, he's the president, isn't he? That's the interesting thing. And he's wearing what I call a Soviet coat. It's the kind of thing you'd have seen Stalin swanning around in. And then the coat moves on to Macbeth when Macbeth, as vice president, assumes power. Did you get that sense? Did you get that flavour? But it's a bit of a banana republic in the sense of there's no real democracy in that state. Well,
that's I think definitely an implication, but at the same time, the show's gimmick, if you want to call it that, is literal audience democracy, because at the end we were given little placards, voting placards, I guess, with the two candidates' names on either side, and at the end we were instructed in song to actually hold up our cards and vote, and the very ending of the show is determined by audience vote.
You're right, there is an actual outcome, which is a proper democratic process as far as we, the audience, are the enfranchised voters of that nation. Yes, that was the second point I was going to ask. It's interesting, therefore, that it actually ends up with what you might call a gimmick, which is the vote. Who do you want? The two candidates by the end are Fleance, which is obviously Fleance, who's been turned into this rather splendid male amalgam of, and the actor came on wearing 6-inch heels.
Right.
And didn't just come on and stand still. Came on and moved in 6-inch heels, which I think there's a BAFTA in there somewhere. But I quite like that. The whole piece about Macbeth is a lot of toxic masculinity, and therefore you have this. I'm going to use the old-fashioned phrase of gender bending just as a shorthand. But the Fleance character is a man who's dressing as a woman, very much of its moment. There's a sense of some sexuality issues going on there as well, against this sort of very sort of straight, in the truest sense of sort of straight and narrow perhaps for Macbeth. He represents the order, he represents military, and you've got Fleance, who's the New Hope. Let's turn this into Star Wars. But those are the two candidates. It's very often the dichotomy we get, isn't it, in a political runoff between two candidates. So I liked the contrast, but I like the fact that the story does not resolve in the way that the Macbeth story by Shakespeare resolves. Macbeth is not defeated. And even in this version, depending on how the audience votes, on the night we went, it was Fleance won. Macbeth walks off. Now, there may well be a criminal trial later on that we don't see, but, it ends with the election and the outcome of the election, which is an abrupt and different ending to... Not a badly abrupt, but it's an abrupt and different ending to Macbeth. How did that work for you as a resolution?
Well, the odds of the vote felt tilted, because even though Fleance, I believe, is not necessarily portrayed as a moral ideal, he's still not a murderer.
Yeah.
At least that we know of. So I felt like I'm voting for the guy who's not a murderer, and everything else is secondary.
Low bar politics, is it?
So I feel like the odds were tilted in his favor, and I think what you learned is that only in one show so far has Macbeth won.
Yeah. The very fact that Macbeth had won at all stunned me.
It may have just been the the dynamics of that evening, and maybe he was being particularly charismatic, or maybe the actors' friends were in the audience, or it was late at night and the alcohol had flowed a little bit and people were feeling a little perverse. But
or all of Macbeth's real descendants were in.
It's interesting. I mean, the title is Vote Macbeth, and that's our instruction. Literally, they make it very clear in song. In a funny turn of phrase, they say, "Now, please vote." No, actually, vote. Yeah. Paraphrasing, but that's the message, because you have to jostle an audience to realize that they're being called for non-rhetorical participation. I get why they have that gimmick. It's not really necessary to appreciate the craftsmanship and the fun and energy of this show. It makes sense from a marketing standpoint and a kind of a fun showmanship element.
It's also a good title, if I may say, and that is a hell of a selling point.
It tells you in 2 words what the show is about and how it's different from every other Macbeth show. So I think it's very smart. The show is really well put together. It's very crafted. It feels like it's been workshopped and refined. You'll know more about that than I, since you had the interview. But this is one of 2 shows in Fringe where I most went away thinking we will hear more from this show again.
And that is absolutely the hope. John Paul was saying that, they hope to take this, they're a Glasgow-based theatrical company, and they're hoping to put it on in Glasgow in the next few weeks and months, so do look out for that. But there's a strong hope that they can bring it back to Edinburgh next year, and certainly if they do, I'll be there. Well, from one Macbeth with voting intentions to another with very different intentions. This was a much more overtly comic version of Macbeth called Don't Say Macbeth, which of course alludes to the famous show business superstition. The superstition, if you're not aware of it, is if anyone in show business says Macbeth, then disaster occurs. It's sort of talismanic and an omen of bad news. Bad things will happen. Don't Say Macbeth takes this concept to a very profoundly farcical, legitimate outcome, but with a conclusion which is so ridiculously absurd that it actually takes place stage off, but with some magnificent sound effects involving a piano, and I shall say no more than that. But we both saw Don't Say Macbeth, but we saw it on different occasions. What's your take on it, Mike? And do you want to briefly explain what it was?
Sure. Well, to be fair, it's not technically a Macbeth adaptation, because it's about a problem-ridden theater production company that is staging an adaptation of Macbeth. And I believe it was Macbeth from the show within the show is the story of Macbeth from the standpoint of the 3 witches, the Weird Sisters.
Yes.
And it is meant to be a sort of a feminist perspective. It's very tongue-in-cheek, but the idea is we are seeing, I guess, the prehistory of Macbeth through their eyes, very much like Wicked, where you're learning what's behind this mysterious, apparently villainous character that makes you sympathetic to them. How was their heart broken, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the show within the show, of which we only see glimpses.
Yes.
Which is all you'd really want to see of something that's meant to be kind of a send-up of contemporary retellings. But the bulk of the show is a Noises Off-esque farce about the poor, misbegotten theater company that is having problem after problem staging the show. So the show within the show is kind of the plot. Can they do it successfully? There are pressures from within and without. The composer is beleaguered, but also admits that he's a problem with plagiarism.
Yes.
And the songs we hear from the show within the show, to use our favorite term, diegetic, are all meant to be reminiscent of songs from existing shows. Not parodies, but so close that you say, oh, right, I see what he was unconsciously doing there. Of course, the similarity is conscious on the part of the real-life composer because it's done for comedic value. But in the show, that's one of their problems. And he's got terrible writer's block, and he's pounding out the big 10 o'clock number at the last minute.
He hasn't written the finale on the day of production.
Right. So as you can imagine, that makes for very funny comic tension. Some of the other problems is you have a very narcissistic Hollywood import as one of the cast members, and another one is a very impulsive, clueless, ditzy, heart-on-sleeve actress who's fallen in love with the music director and constantly think that the music director is secretly in love with her, when in fact he is very distracted by the technician who's come in.
There's a young, handsome man who's basically it's rather taken his focus.
And so that's distracting the MD, and the technician is also a very poor technician.
Yes.
So, and the heart of this show is the director who's pulling her hair out, trying to keep everything together. And there is a visiting producer who applies a lot of pressure because the producer is also from the mob.
Yes,
by implication.
Yes, that's the way I read it. I read her as a sort of American Chicago gangster kind of thing, who's obviously this play is a money laundering exercise, but also there's always this sense that the cast and crew are going to be, when I say the word punished, obviously possibly up to a fatal level, by their producer essentially.
So you have all these forces stacked up against the production, and there's also the lingering superstition about saying Macbeth in a theater, and every now and then a character is unconsciously about to utter the name, at which point everyone joins in and repeats the title of the show in unison. So it's a lot of fun. And
we're grinning as we describe it.
We are. It was a blast. It's very, as you say, overtly comedic. But I should add that the characters are legitimately likable. They have a problem. We're on board with their problem. We get that they want to stage the show, and we want them to succeed. So I think it functions as a musical rather than just being comedy for comedy's sake with songs thrown in. It really is a legitimate musical for all its semi-parody-like references to other shows.
What I like is that very difficult balance. And we discussed this because we had the privilege of meeting the company behind is called Goya Theatre, and they had 2 shows up. But this one, the songs were written by Math Roberts, and we interviewed him alongside Sam Wolfe, who was the composer for the other show, which we'll be talking about later, called Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes. But for Don't Say Macbeth, Math was the musical director on stage, but he was also the musical director of the piece in real life and the composer of the piece in real life. And the balance it had to strike was, how do you write bad songs for a show which are good enough then to be able to work in the legitimate show that you're watching, which is about this bad show being put on? And there was a clever conceit, wasn't there? And we discussed this with him, that there's one song which is sung by the ditzy actress who's terrible as an actress. And terribly self-centered as well, and she cannot sing. She makes Florence Foster Jenkins look like at least adequate. And so she sings this big number badly halfway through the show for comic effect. But then there's this clever conceit where the song comes up again at the end, and because of some disaster, she unexpectedly sings it. The same actress, the terrible actress in the piece, as portrayed, sings the piece with heartfelt sincerity, and the song comes alive. The fact that you can write a song that does that. Now, I'm fully aware that actually the trick here is that the performance is bad the first time round, which disguises the quality of the song. So you think it's a bad song, and it isn't actually a bad song. And then the quality of the performance later on shows the song off, showcases the song for what it is. But there were several examples of this all the way through where the songs were terribly good and yet had to work in sort of with 2 faces and almost throw themselves on the fire for comic effect, when in fact they were sort of better than the material they were being offered up for. Whilst at the same time I'm praising the overall show, which was about this terrible show taking place. So we're talking at 2 levels as we discuss it.
Right.
But what a clever thing to have written.
And it's also a challenge for any singer to sing badly if they're not a bad singer.
Yes, if they can do it well, quite.
If they've been trained to be on pitch all the time, then singing off pitch is this act of concentration and effort. And it's a skill, actually. Ironically, it's a skill. So
yes, it is.
There's an interesting distinction here that touches upon a topic that you and I have discussed in the past, and that is the distinction between parody musicals and sincere musicals. And we've talked about if a show establishes itself in what we call the parody universe, where it's out to make fun of things, it's a little mean-spirited but in a funny way, and it exists as a kind of criticism or at least a poking fun of something, that it's very hard to bond with a show once it's established that tone in a sincere way. It's very hard to get out of the parody universe once they're in. This show, even though it had some parody-like qualities in that these songs were often allusions to existing Broadway hits, and the inner show, the show within the show, was obviously an example of an interpretation of Shakespeare that's meant to be so high concept and sort of twisted and off balance that it's ridiculous.
It's unwatchable.
The actual outer show felt sincere. We really did bond with these characters. It established the rules of the universe where everything was sort of silly and exaggerated over the top, but it stuck to that universe, and within those laws, those kinds of characters that could exist, the mafioso who is also a secret musical theater fan, it stuck within the rules of its world, and it was sincere, and we really were happy for the outcome. So I think this succeeded in straddling that dangerous line between being a send-up and being a legitimate musical in its own right, and ending up being the latter. And you don't, as an audience member, you don't sit there calculating this. You're not actually thinking, this is not a parody at all, but you feel that kind of warm glow of bonding during the show that you might not with something that was really meant to be a parody.
So if it were a sandwich, the sandwich overall is a sincere sandwich, but it has a parody filling.
That's a good way of putting it.
Can I particularly pay tribute to the actress who played the director, the terribly troubled director who was trying so hard to make the show work in the face of, she was the sort of the lone voice of sanity, but pushed to the absolute edge of where that sanity was. She was on the thresholds. I thought her comic skills were remarkable, and she reminded me very much, and this is a positive thing, of Jessica Hines, who's a well-known actress here, who has brilliant comedy skills. And I got a sense of someone who is sincerely trying to direct a sincere show, but unable to control all the elements in it, the disparate elements. The director has a big role in creating and bringing a cohesive whole, and it was that cohesive whole failing to happen that made it more into a whole without the W, as it were, in the play within the play. But you've retained sympathy for her as well at the same time. I thought she was the character I found most sympathy for. And that's quite an acting feat as well, that double-barreled, she is an incompetent director. She is unable to do the things which are required of her, and yet at the same time, you absolutely want her to succeed, and you like her as a person, and, you feel her pain. She is your avatar as an audience member, as a speech marks, a normal person in a world of zanies.
I agree. It's the same angle as, I think, the producers.
Yes. Actually, that's a very good point, yeah. So this is the directors.
And speaking of cast appreciation, what was striking to me, we mentioned that the same group, the same writers and the same cast had produced another show, which we're going to discuss later. I saw both shows within 3 hours of one another. So I sat down and saw the same actor. I felt like I slipped into a parallel universe where the same people decided to do a different show. And they were in completely different roles that exercised different aspects of comedic and dramatic ability. And it's just very strange to see the same people do a complete... I don't even understand how actors can memorize their lines for one show. So to see them do two in a row, and almost back to back, was really impressive. So hats off to everyone involved in both shows.
Oh yes, I think Goya Theatre really proven themselves. I mean, they're established anyway, but in this year, by having these two shows together, which really showcased the breadth of what they can do and the breadth of the individuals in their teams. And as you've mentioned it, Mike, probably now's the time to then talk about the other show, which was called Sex with Friends, brackets, and Other Tiny Catastrophes. Close brackets, actually. We might as well close that bracket.
Right.
Which totally was entirely different, wasn't it? It was more traditional in the sense of, or rather, it was a trope which has been explored elsewhere over many years in many places, of a group of friends getting together at a stage of transition in their lives, where things are changing, and can the friendship group survive? That's the broadest way of describing it. In this sense, it's there was a group of friends meeting, but with a new friend sort of joining into the group, who was not immediately accepted because she was a rather hard-hearted American character, I'm sorry to say, Mike, but a hard-hearted sort of city type in a group of liberals, shall we say. That was the dynamic. And yet she does link up with one of the characters who's the most left-wing of the characters in the piece. So, a relationship you wouldn't have thought necessarily would have wings. It flowers for a while, and then it breaks up. But they both stay in the group in its sort of extended way as the group starts to split up, and there's a mother character, if you like. She's not a mother character. There's a character who has...
Essentially a daughter, in that she's taking care of her...
That's right. She gets the flat. That's right, because she's looking after her mother. But but it's that character who, if you like, is the linchpin of the group, and she's trying desperately to keep the group together as they all go off and get jobs or want to travel. Couples break up. Individual members of that couple may link up with other people. So people are linking up and breaking up over the course of an hour. Sometimes when you see shows like this, you wonder why these people are friends at all, because I've seen versions here and other fringes where the group looks so disparate to begin with that you just think, well, these people should have stopped being friends some time ago, and it's only shared history and time that's keeping them together. I didn't get that with this group. I did get the impression they were still friends, but certainly my view is that even though the friendship group breaks up as a group, the individual elements of the group will form
different smaller relationships in ones, twos, and possibly threes from what's left. I suppose it's like it's like a solar system breaking up, as it were. As the planets move away, they sort of get caught into each other's orbits, but the actual solar system itself no longer exists. That's quite a big way of looking at it.
Speaking from personal experience, because I don't know. Presumably, this hasn't happened to our solar system recently, so. It was a strange analogy. Anyway, but I see what the thrust of what you're saying is. This is a genre I call 20-somethings in an enclosed space. You hear it, you see it both in musicals and non-musicals. I think it's a natural topic or sort of story framework for young writers who are writing what they know, and they have life experiences that are fresh in their memory. So there's been a couple of examples of this, both musically and non-musically, at this year's Fringe. What I thought was skillfully done here was the quality of the songs, the songwriting, I thought was noteworthy. Most of it fell into a contemporary idiom where it doesn't feel ripped from the pop charts, but it feels informed by contemporary pop music. It felt very skillfully written for the performers themselves, and in some cases the composer was the performer. For me, one of the standouts was what we'd call a complaint song, and a lament where a gay character was giving an outsider perspective on straight relationships. It was full of details, and it was really funny. And it was delivered by the composer.
Sam Wolf.
Right, who was the composer, author, both?
Yes, I think he was both. He was certainly the composer.
So it felt, in this case, the music felt very well tailored for the delivery and the performer. That's not surprising. But throughout, I thought the music was noteworthy in how well it served both musically and often in story purposes as well.
Yes, it was a very accomplished piece. I think, because one bought into the characters, as I say, one felt that there were still friendships to be had in that group, but they weren't all hateful people. And indeed, the most hateful of the persons we saw certainly becomes much more likeable by the end. There's a trajectory there of self-realization, but also outer realization that that we're part of a wider mass of people. So, and indeed, she also, if you like, she starts off very selfish and then ends up in this relationship which looks so strange, and yet you also very much buy into. And then that breaks up, and she goes on to, it is presumably the transformative nature of that relationship, which, even though the relationship is unsuccessful, carries her on a journey to becoming a teacher, I think, eventually. She's given up a city job, essentially, to become a teacher. I quite liked a lot of those journeys. I'm going to be honest, I struggled a little bit more. There was a character who's in a long-term straight relationship, who, when that relationship breaks up...
he switches teams.
Yes, that's a very nice way of putting it. Yes, he sort of finds himself, through friendship, in a gay relationship with the character portrayed by Sam, the composer. And I mean, this does happen. So there's no, these people do realise their sexuality, and later on, I think he actually overtly states himself as being bisexual. So it's actually a discovery of more of himself. So it wasn't a negation of who he was; it was an expansion of who he was. And I could buy it on that basis, but it isn't. It took me a while to realise that was the trajectory, because sometimes it can look like a handbrake turn. It didn't in this, but I'm glad I'm glad there was that clarification of where he sat on the sexual spectrum, for want of a better phrase. Let's all get Kinsey about this.
Right.
But the piece overall was terribly successful, terribly enjoyable. There was another lovely song about each of the characters at some stage has some problem in their life that they're trying to grapple with, whether it be big or small, and then they just basically, the song is called Google It, Let's Google It, which I think is also a nice sort of observation. I suppose all these songs are very terribly observational.
I agree.
So there's a sharp eye and a sharp ear behind the writing of this, about the weaknesses of human nature, I think. I would like to raise something that you raised with me, however, and this is more about the genre rather than this specific show, but you have made the observation about what happens when your characters are without agency. And in a group of 20-somethings where they feel that the establishment and the world is positioned in such a way that they don't themselves have much opportunity to control their outcomes, except perhaps in these tiny catastrophes. I mean, they don't have any big power or big locus in their lives, but they can make small changes like changing their partner or changing their jobs and things like that. You have said that, of course, it then takes the dynamics out of a show. I'm not saying this show suffered from it, But I'd like to explore that a little bit more with you, I think.
Agency is something that characters have by degrees. In some shows, we see characters are very active and they are constantly making decisions, and the plot may be driven by those decisions. So I'm just going to pull one example of infinite selections, but Wicked is an example where the character is constantly making choices and is impacting the story. And on the other extreme, you could have a show like Company, where the main character is essentially an observational camera who just is commenting on others' relationships, and at the end has a kind of contrived self-realization that I never found convincing, but I know other people weep over it. But anyway,
but that's the journey for that character. You're right. He's more of a passive character on which people project.
Exactly right.
So where is he?
So it's a continuum from activity to passivity, and I think by nature the 20-somethings in a enclosed space genre tends to lean towards projecting a feeling of sympathetic helplessness, a feeling of being overwhelmed by the world, of things not working out the way you expected, and relaying your emotional response to those realities as they descend. And as you observed, there are micro decisions along the way, the starting or termination of relationships being a common one, or decisions to travel, to break up with the group. But there's often a feeling of being carried along by the wings of change and not being captain of your own ship, to mix two metaphors in one sentence. This did ultimately, I think, I don't need to telegraph the ending blow by blow, but I think this did tend to lean in this direction of not giving the characters full agency of their futures. If we think of a classical tragedy, we have a character making decisions and then things work out badly, but they're often the result of the character's decisions being poor. In this case, there are a few micro decisions along the way, but there's still a sense of a big question mark at the end. And I think the emotional payload of the show is a sense of maybe humility or hopeful helplessness or wonderment at the way that life can divert you from your expectations. To me personally, that will always be a limitation in how I can emotionally respond. I'm someone who is emotionally attached to the ideas of characters being deliberate and making decisions for better or for ill. But there are people who resonate very strongly with the idea of being carried along by the wings of change. And I think this show will be up their alley very directly.
And I would like to sort of move on from this show, because we loved it. And, we should... Exactly as you say, it's a repertory company, essentially Goya Theatre, and they had done these two shows back to back, essentially, in two different venues within several hours, portraying very different things, doing different things, and really excelling across the board, and in excellent musicals. The songs were good in both cases, doing very different things. So, there's a thumbs up to both of these people, both of these shows, and the people behind it. But taking that agency point, the lost 20-somethings, if you like, idea, there was a show which I saw which you didn't, I think, which was called Living with Sin. And I just want to touch on it briefly, because actually it starts from a similar place and then goes off in a totally different direction, which is, in Living with Sin, the central character is a character called Cece. And she is, if you like, more like the Robert in Company than she is a character like Macbeth. Macbeth, for better or worse, is partly the master of his own destiny.
Or the cause of his own destiny.
Well, yes, not the master. That's quite the right answer, yes. But Cece basically has been living with her grandmother in her grandmother's very old-fashioned house, and the grandmother has died. And so we start at a funeral. And she's in her young 20s. She's now alone in a very old-fashioned house, and she is a character who is utterly helpless. She's relied almost entirely on her grandmother for every kind of support, it seems. Familial, because the mother's not there, and doesn't come to the funeral, so we have to assume that she's dead or off. And then Cece, after the funeral, which is full of friends and well-wishers telling her that she needs to do something with her life, be more active, she comes back to the house and essentially flops. And in her case, her saviours, if you like, are the human personification of the 7 deadly sins, which is such an interesting concept. Or it was to me. I really like the fact that each of the 7 characters, and it's important to say they are not the abstract concept. They are a person. So each of the characters was portrayed by an actor or an actress, and each of those actors or actresses portrayed something of the sin that they represented. So Roth was quite an angry character, as you can imagine, but not only an angry character. And that was the wonderful thing, the personification of the concept of the seven deadly sins. And I discussed this with the director, Ilona Sell, in a conversation, was that two things. That the seven deadly sins, of course, are handed down to us culturally as bad things. And Kurt Weill had something to say about it, of course, in his 1930s musical. But actually, if you were to live a life without any kind of anger, if you were to live a life without any kind of envy at all, if you were to live a life without any kind of gluttony, by which don't eat food,
repression,
these are bad things. So actually, the whole thing about each of the seven deadly sins is they represent a spectrum. And the secret is not to abolish them from your lives, but to work out where you sit on the spectrum for each of them. And the personification of these characters to somewhere in the middle, but displaying their characteristic, help. They basically live and do quite a lot of dancing around Cece. Cece essentially is encouraged to see through the activity of the seven deadly sins, who you sort of get the sense are sort of eternal creatures who have lived in this house for generations. And have sort of stepped out from the wood panelling walls to assist Cece now that she's on her own and needs this help. They become the method by which she finds herself. Her agency is returned to her through, or is found by her, through realising that so many of the strictures and the rules that society says you should or shouldn't have are actually need to be tweaked ever so slightly. And so in this case, she realises that she can't live without the seven deadly sins, but just not at the full max. She needs an element of anger to drive her. That's a dynamic. Anger in the right place in a controlled environment is helpful. And as a show, I found that really helpful. Now, Cece does but she's a very, she's essentially a passive character on a journey being carried by these characters to self-awareness at the end. But that's very difficult to portray. So it's not the actress, I'd like to praise the actress who retained sympathy whilst having to play this sort of very passive-y character. But I was so interested in the concept of this piece, the high concept, if you like, of the seven deadly sins being, as I say, personable because they were persons.
From your description, it sounds reminiscent of the Pixar movie Inside Out, which delivers a similar message about seemingly negative psychological experiences such as anger and jealousy and sadness as actually being healthy in moderate portions
and formative
to a fully functioning psychology. And we could also look at the Pixar film Soul, which looked at the dark side of a work ethic as potentially being disruptive of one's life balance. So it sounds like it's very much along those lines. Now, you could take issue with the phrasing and say that anger shouldn't really be thought of as a sin, or it could just be a little more specific by saying excessive anger,
yes,
or misplaced anger. But I think
uncontrolled anger. Quite.
But it sounds like the point is well made. You mentioned it's sort of shifting gears in terms of agency versus passivity. Was there something that's worth mentioning along these lines?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, she basically has experiences, i.e. time with, and gets to know each of the seven characters, and they all have names which are slightly different to their actual characteristic. So, Envy isn't called Envy, she's called Emma or something like that. They have names which are similar to, but are human names, recognisable names. And she talks and meets them in different combinations. And I say there's a lot of dance and movement in this piece. Now, dance and movement doesn't often work for me, but actually what it allowed you to do, it allowed you to have all these seven disparate characterizations and characteristics of humans working together and in harmony. So through dance you can see the holistic element of what it is to be human. But it really sort of comes to a fore when Cece basically has a good sit-down chat, having had all these interactions with one of the characteristics who's the most motherly of them as well. So, and she has this chat, and I think she's, by observing and then by conversing, she is able then to find understanding. So it's done dramatically, but I have to say I think it's one of those shows with the dance and the movement really, if you like, underscores the message, more almost than the music, although I love the songs.
How would you characterise the musical style?
Slinky, actually, is the word. Quite a lot of the dance was Fosse-esque, which brings its own problems. As I've said before, I can never work out whether Fosse is being sincere or not, because to me, it looks like he's sending himself up. But of course, no one had done it that way beforehand, so he's also original. It's like he's sending. It's both sincere and
self-caricaturing.
Self-caricaturing, yes, quite. Now, it wasn't a blow for blow Fosse. It was Fosse-esque, and I think the slinkiness is what I'm drawing from there. But I would say that the music was, on the whole, it's sort of. If the music was anything, it was sort of anything from about 1920 to about 1945, sort of cabaret-ish, jazzy, slinky. You could imagine the dancing taking place. It wasn't contemporary in that sense. I mean, there was enough contemporary sense to the piece. It didn't feel like a period piece. But the music, by being slightly retro, really also helped, I think, underpin the sort of the eternal nature of the seven deadly sins living in the house. I probably don't want to say any more than that, but just to say that once again, it tied in with Sex with Friends, because Cece is essentially a passive character who with no agency, and it is others who work upon her, or her observations of others, not unlike Company, as you say. And perhaps we'll just finish this conversation today by mentioning that I also saw a fabulous version of Company. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because I did interview a lot of the people involved in it, but as we've mentioned it, I should say, it's just nice to see, in this first year since Sondheim's passing, people doing Sondheim properly and sincerely. And the thing about Company is there's a never-ending discussion as to be had about Robert and his agency, and or her agency, in this version it was a he, but it was a terribly good one, and it was so nice to talk to them, and people will be able to hear this interview in a future episode, to talk to both the star who played Robert, an actor by the name of Connor, plus the people behind the show as producer and directors, because it's a show, I think, where the director has to make a decision, and so does the actor, what motivates Robert. And there are so many different ways of interpreting Robert from a point of view as an audience, but actually the actor and the directors have to make a decision on that. How passive is he going to be? Is he going to change at the end, or is it actually a realisation that he's not going to change at the end? Is he, in fact, bearing in mind it's set in 1970, a closeted gay character, which is one of the reasons he can't actually sort of form a long-term commitment? Who is Robert? There's still no answer 50 years later, really. So, Mike, thank you very much for this little gallop through just a small number of the shows we saw in Edinburgh, although they're all very different. And I think that really gives us an example of, the variety that was on display this time. So until next time, Mike, thank you.
Likewise.
Musical talk. Well, there we are. A conversation with Michael Gordon-Shapiro about just 7 of the shows that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And they were Stephen Sondheim's Company, Living with Sin, Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes, For Queen and Country, and then the MacBeth trilogy, all unrelated it must be said, MacBeth the musical, Vote Macbeth, and Don't Say Macbeth. And each of those shows was absolutely fabulous and well worth talking about and discussing here on Musical Talk, which is just as well, because we will also be having fuller conversations with some of the people behind those shows, or at least some of them, in the next few weeks and months. Well, they'll be talking more in depth about those shows and also the creative process, which is something I know that everybody likes talking about here on Musical Talk. But that, I think, wraps up this episode. And as we've been going on for well over an hour now, it seems to me probably right that I shut up and let you get on with the rest of your week so that you can husband your resources, to use an old-fashioned phrase, in order to gear up and be perfectly ready for next week's episode of Musical Talk, when we'll be doing more of the same thing that we've been doing for, 15 years. And so finally, to misquote Shakespeare, after much ado and quite a lot of nothing, it's time for me to stop talking. So I'm going to. And I'm going to do it by saying one final wrapping up kind of a word. And here it is. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos and Mike Shapiro, and edited by Thos. Although I would like to extend my thanks to Mike for some of his technical assistance in cleaning up these recordings. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.
Test, test, test. This is my normal speaking voice, which is too small, too soft.
Too small?
Too small. Well, it is too small.
Doesn't fit.
Yeah. But I'm also trying to be careful where I don't end up being louder than you, which has happened in a couple of episodes. So
yes, although these days I think my balances are a lot better, partly because of the advice you've given me over the years. So anyway.
This is probably a reasonable ratio given our respective loudness. And again, I will put dynamic compression so it will even out the levels and make the whole thing a little more.
Yeah.
I have a wonderful plugin that is a circuit-by-circuit imitation or emulation of a SSL console. And has a lovely compressor that just makes the whole thing puts it in an elegant golden tunnel, as opposed to the wide-ranging dynamic chaos of a typical recording. And I've just gotten so much mileage out of it.
Well, we are literally recording this in a concert hall, so
it's true.
If you can put me in that golden tunnel, that sounds magnificent. I suspect there's an Irwin Allen 1960s science fiction series called The Golden Tunnel, or something to that effect. Come and see the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2022. No, we're in 2022. Right. Come and see the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2023. In British slang, one of the many terms for a mouth is a cake hole, which I think tells you everything you need to know. So shut your cake hole means...
Well, if you're talking about sugar consumption...
Oh, well, there is that, of course.
Yeah, America rules the roost there. Yeah, well, we do have the phantom of the vacuum cleaner.